Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we're talking about a site that built a large audience by mining legal documents from government websites. There's a common misperception that many non-lawyers have about how legal contracts are written. Most people probably assume that a lawyer writes each contract from scratch, but in reality the lawyer is most likely copy and pasting clauses and sections from already existing contracts and modifying them for their particular client. One of the resources lawyers often turn to for this is Law Insider. Founded in 2010, Law Insider indexes the millions of contracts that have been uploaded to the SEC website by publicly traded companies. It generates over 4 million monthly page views and has over 250,000 registered users, about 5,000 of which pay $30 a month to access its archives. I recently interviewed the site's co-founder, Preston Clark, about how he and his partner came up with the idea, what they did to build up its massive audience, and why they're expanding into a full-fledged media company that produces everything from articles to YouTube videos. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about my Substack newsletter. This week I published a 2,700-word deep dive into the YouTube channel run by David Potts. He's generated over 280,000 followers on YouTube and 5,000 paying subscribers on Patreon, and he walked me through how he built up his audience and his monetization strategy. The only way to get access to articles like that one is by subscribing to my Substack newsletter. Go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, now on to my interview with Preston. Hey Preston, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Simon. Great to be on.
So your background isn't in media. You were, I think, once a lawyer, right? And then you got into sales?
Right. Yeah, I practiced law in-house for the University of Miami for a couple of years and quickly discovered that the business was much more interesting to me. So went into sales and business development in SaaS and in tech as sort of my exit out of law.
Yeah. So you were selling SaaS type products. Is that where you kind of got the itch to try to do a startup?
It was. And I right after I left, I tried to start a small business building websites and logos and things of that nature, and invested probably far too much capital to try to get it off the ground, and came out of it saying, wow, I just dumped all this money and I have literally nothing to show for it. So if I do this again, after I sort of recoup my losses, let's make sure that I can build something that is sustainable long term, even if I don't have a ton of money to invest in it. So that's sort of foreshadowing a bit about what we built at Law Insider. But yeah, the entry into SaaS and into subscription revenue, and sort of the obsession for MRR and understanding CAC and churn and everything else came from being a salesperson in SaaS, and that was certainly a big sort of educational advantage as we started building Law Insider.
Yeah, that's a great thing about content. Even though I am doing something like business-wise, different things today than I was 8 years ago, I still have the content I was creating 8 years ago.
Right.
It's still providing value to me because I'm covering kind of the same beat as I was. So like people, as long as you're still paying the minimum hosting bills, your content can kind of live on forever. And like you said, it's not like, but if you create like some kind of new platform, SaaS platform, and it doesn't take off, and then you shut it down, then you pretty much have nothing to show for it. Whereas even if you create a content type startup, it can still continue providing value to you, even if you're no longer running it afterwards, is kind of what it sounds like your thinking was.
Yeah. And that's such a powerful insight, Simon. And I think every time I see in TechCrunch or whatever, a legal tech company called Atrium was, what sort of shuttered its doors, I think, in March of last year. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, like think how much brand equity and all these things that went into that. And, millions and millions of dollars. And now it's just gone. And like, I have nightmares about that, personally, like they probably had very good reasons to do that and return, a lot of investment dollars to investors, et cetera. But The idea that you could put forth so much energy into something, and then, just one day turn off the lights is frankly terrifying to me personally as an entrepreneur. So definitely try to avoid that.
So you want to create something that's, that has long-term value. What sparked the original idea that would become Law Insider?
Sure. So through my sort of role as a salesperson, in this sort of adjacent to legal technology, got exposed to Rocket Lawyer and LegalZoom and started to understand what they were building, and saw that a lot of the traffic that they were building was from websites that were, sort of SEO kings of contract and legal information. And stumbled upon a couple of these sites and sort of deconstructed them and said, this is interesting. These sites in very simple ways have started aggregating publicly available legal information. In this sense, it was contracts, and just started connecting some dots and said, well, what if we really went deep on this and tried at least to compile the world's largest contract database and get smart with the data, how we organized, get really good at search, and potentially maybe build something that lawyers would use. It's sort of getting ahead of ourselves here, but as I think you might imagine, lawyers draft contracts the same way a business person drafts a contract, which is you don't start with a blank piece of paper. You're always starting with something, a template, a contract you used previously. So a contract you got from a friend or a colleague. And so aggregating everything seemed like a really, really valuable resource. But in order for it to ultimately work, you'd have to really, you'd have to have a high level of adoption, which meant, as from an SEO perspective, takes quite a bit of time. So that was sort of some of the foundational ideas or inspiration for building it.
Yeah. So just to kind of translate what you're saying is like when a lawyer goes to write a contract and they need to write like an indemnification clause, or I don't even know what that means, but something like that, they're not writing that contract from scratch. They're copying, pasting it either from one of their previous contracts or from another contract that somebody else wrote, and then they're customizing it to their specific client's needs, taking out the name of the other client, putting that in as the first basis thing, but then also maybe changing up some things so that it's more customized, right? That's what you're talking about? Like that, yeah. That's what the resource is?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's if you consider the everything else, the last mile is probably the most important and the hardest part, and is ultimately the part that you're paying for. I think when you pay someone to build a website, you don't imagine that they're sitting there inventing new code. They're going to go pull from templates and other things that exist, and then they're going to modify that for your specific needs. And if they spent 90% of the time writing something from scratch, the bill would be much bigger, and it's uncertain if the quality would be any better. So yeah, you explained it better than I did. I think that the idea is that lawyers, entrepreneurs, et cetera, are using contracts or drafting contracts off of building blocks, and where you source those building blocks ends up being really important to doing something effective and efficient.
And where did you find these contracts to put into your database?
Sure. So the largest public database available is from Edgar. It's from the SEC. So publicly traded companies need to publish material documents to the business, and some of those are press releases, some of those are financial filings, and some of them are contracts. It turns out a lot of them are contracts, and so we found a way to extract and aggregate and organize those in a way that we weren't the first to do it. We haven't been the last. We just think we've been the most focused on it. This is all we do. All we do is contracts. And so we're adding, and dating back 7 years, adding thousands of documents every month. And then from there, it started, the repository got bigger, the database got bigger. And as our traffic got bigger, we started saying, where else are publicly available contracts housed? And it turns out that lots of government websites have it. And then it's, hey, this isn't just a US thing. Like let's go look at what the Australian government is publishing. Let's go look at what's in Chile and Argentina, and let's add multi-language. So it's taken off a lot since its initial inception. But it started with one massive database from the SEC.
So, like, just to translate, so like when Tesla form some kind of contract with like a manufacturer, because Tesla is a publicly traded company and has to disclose a lot of stuff. Part of that disclosure involves that contract actually ending up on a government website, right?
Right. Yeah. So good example. I think an example that your listeners could go look up is I think that Elon Musk's, I want to say, termination agreement from PayPal, not like he was fired, but like his separation agreement when he ended his employment had some stock grant or something else. Like that's on our website because that was a material document to PayPal, which was a publicly traded company. And so you can go search, deals that Elon Musk was a part of and other key executives. So you can, once all this data is aggregated, then yeah, you're looking at compensation for executives who we read about, the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs of the world, and employment agreements and termination agreements and purchase agreements. So when one business acquires another, all of these end up in this database.
So when did you launch Law Insider, and how did you go about extracting the data from all these government websites and putting it on your website? Like, was it just you? I guess it was just you and a business partner, right? So were you just manually going and doing this at first?
No, so it was, so I have two co-founders. I am the least technical of the three. And so I sort of had the initial spark of an idea of an opportunity, but it took a lot of brain power to figure out how to do this at scale, because it was never, the vision was never to do this manually. I think we have, over 2 million contracts in the database today. And I assure you that was not done, one by one. So it was about natural language search and identifying patterns in contracts that made them contracts, right? Because the SEC, and the reason why the reason why the SEC isn't just doing this for us is that it's not their job to make it easy for you to discover contracts. They've aggregated this information in the way that suits them, which is great. But it's not making it easy to go find 1,000 employment agreements or 10,000 indemnification clauses. That sort of requires a different layer of extraction and ultimately of filtering, and tagging and lots of metadata of what's in this contract. What clauses does it have? How many, does it have a salary provision or a compensation provision? Does it have a termination clause? Does it have a liquidated damages clause? All of these data points had to be built out, and that took some work. And we've had, to answer your initial question, we've been at this about 8 years, just over 7 years. And so we've gotten a lot better. I think in the beginning, we were collecting lots of things from the SEC that weren't contracts, or we were mistagging or miscategorizing. And so we've gotten better, and our machines have gotten better the more we've extracted and organized these documents.
And when did you launch it?
8 years ago.
So that was what, like 2013?
Yeah. Yep.
And how long after you started adding these contracts to your database did they start finding an audience, and where were most people coming from?
Yeah, great question. So this was always a side project, which was sort of what was interesting to me and my co-founders, because I was chief revenue officer for a SaaS compliance business, and my other business partners were in tech jobs, and we were like, let's go do something that we can tinker on nights, weekends, but that will grow, and we'll have, because SEO was always going to be the play, that we could give it the air it needed to breathe, so we wouldn't have to look at it every 3 months and say, oh, it's not generating X dollars yet. So for five and a half, almost 6 of the 8 years this has been in existence, it was just a long tail SEO play. And Simon, a lot of this was because, as we started this conversation, I didn't have the expertise to be a writer or a podcaster. And so many of your guests are the experts. Not always, like great podcast with Insider Inc. and Claudius, by the way. I thought that's one of my favorites. But in some cases, you have just business operators who are building great content businesses. But in some cases, it's the expert that is sort of the initial driver, and then you build an editorial team and everything else. But for us, like I couldn't, like none of us were going to be the thought leaders or the subject matter expert to create a brand. And so it needed to be something that we could aggregate that already existed, that was publicly available. So that sort of was the genesis of the idea. And fast forward years, we started just adding little gates, not paywalls, but, you want to download this, you want to download a contract, you want to copy a clause. This is your third contract or your third clause. Now you're going to see a pop-up. And you're going to, you need to give us your email address and maybe a little bit of information about you. And I'm sorry to connect really quickly to a previous podcast you did with Insider Inc. A comment that Claudius had made on that podcast was that they looked for types of assets or resources that were unique to them. So it wasn't just a business story that 10 other news outlets had already reported on. It was something that was unique, downloadable, gated, that creates this moment of, I really need this thing. And we discovered that that's what contracts are, because attorneys need these documents, and email is a pretty easy gate. If, I give you my email address and you're going to give me this document that I need, that's awesome. And so we did that. And what we started seeing, Simon, was that literally hundreds of people a day were trading their email address for access to a document. And you think, wow, we have 1 million plus documents, organized, structured, and really well indexed in Google. A lead capture, email capture machine had been built. So we probably could have monetized a lot earlier than we did, but I think we were so keen on seeing what was possible from a lead acquisition or email acquisition perspective that we just let it run. And then maybe getting to the next question. And then about 2 years ago, flip the switch. It was harder than that because we don't have e-commerce backgrounds, but flip the switch on a premium membership model.
Okay, we'll get to that in a few moments. But so for the SEO, it sounds like that was mainly your main audience driver especially early years. Can you give them a sense of like how rich this database is, in the sense of like what were people typing into Google? Because like you can actually type into Google specific kinds of clauses and stuff like that. Like it's not like they're just searching by contract, right? Like it's a much more granular, that all this, like you said, that you had all this rich tagging and stuff like that made basically like an SEO powerhouse of your website, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's if we have a moat, I think maybe we have two moats. One is time, because we've just been doing this for as long as we have, and the other is the long tail aspect of what we do from a keyword perspective. So yeah, to your question, someone can go after us and push us down the page in Google for sample indemnification clause or sample sales agreement. And we, that's fine, because we rank in the first page for, literally tens of thousands of keywords. And it can be really nuanced combinations, Simon. New York indemnification clause sample, separation agreement, Florida. It could be Elon Musk termination, PayPal, a date, like all of these massive, complex searches where someone is looking for a very, very specific document or type of document. And that's where we rank, where there are search. I wish I could think of one off the top of my head, but I encourage your listeners to just type something in, a clause name or a contract type that has as many characters as possible in terms of its specificity, date, location, drafting parties, executives involved. And in many cases, we'll rank not just in the first 2 spots. Some cases we'll rank all 10 spots on the first page of Google, because it's such a long tail that we've developed over the years.
And so you say then eventually, tons of people are coming in every day. So you add, what we in the business call a registration gate, saying, hey, you're free to keep on, accessing all this information for free, but you need to create an account in which you're going to give us an email address. So, and you said you were generating like hundreds of new email accounts a day, right? Like how quickly did you start like really building up a huge database of potential people to start marketing to?
Yeah, good question. So I think, as you know, SEO is just slow. It's slow going in the beginning, and so we were, I think, we were 3 years in before it got interesting, Simon. I think before we were over 100,000 page views a month, and then it just started taking off from there, and growing in really exciting ways. We're seeing over 100% year over year traffic growth on the site, and yeah, I think that we started discovering and seeing patterns that it was, especially for clauses, which I think is sort of was a magical insight, that lots of entrepreneurs are searching for things like sample employment agreement, because an entrepreneur just wants to do that him or herself. Whereas something like a liquidated damages clause, you can guess it's lawyers who are looking for that. And so that we ranked so highly for very nuanced clause terms and contract types, we started seeing a really high level of lawyers that were registering with their lawyer email address. And we saw big law firms and small law firms and international law firms and in-house attorneys in Japan and in Bali, and just this amazing diversity of users all looking for sample contracts. So it was, the first few years, seeing the patterns and seeing the diversity of users and seeing what the long tail was bringing to us. If anything, it was exciting, but it's obvious now in hindsight. Now, you may have perspectives on this too, Simon, but it's obvious now what our business model is and should be. But 4 years ago, with all of that traffic, we're trying ads and signing up for different ad networks to see how much revenue we could drive with that. And it was all underwhelming, even with our traffic booming. And so despite this amazing email list and everything else, and this was before Morning Brew, and I think this is just before we knew, certainly before Substack, it was just unclear how we were going to monetize. But we knew that if literally hundreds of lawyers every day are signing up on our site, that we had something. We just didn't know what we had.
So we're talking so far about non-editorial content. You eventually started adding some editorial into the mix. Was that prior or after you started monetizing with the metered paywall?
Yeah, it was after, because we didn't have any money to invest. So we wanted to, and we've learned so much since then. So sort of side note, but the legal research market is dominated by, it's a duopoly. So there's Thomson Reuters and there's LexisNexis that sit on top of it, and they have these massive contracts with the biggest law firms in the country that in some cases are spending millions of dollars with them a year, and they built their businesses first and primarily on publicly available legal information, not contract data specifically, but other case filings and Supreme Court information and resources, et cetera. There's other information that's publicly available, but their differentiation, how they've solidified their position, is that over time they hired these massive editorial teams that were summarizing and creating briefs and memos and analyzing complex court decisions, and that became the value of the business. So I think we always sort of knew that what lawyers need more than templates, contract templates as an example, is they need guides and resources and information that's distilling what we're giving them access to. So I think we always aspired to that, but we just didn't have the resources. And yeah, to your question, it's been the last 18 months or so that we've made a lot of investments there. And we've seen the success of that early, where customers are staying longer, where our NPS is going up, seeing better reviews on G2 and other places. So generally speaking, we sort of knew what our North Star would be relative to editorial content. It just, it took us launching the subscription to have the budget to even think about investing there.
So talk about launching a subscription. How did that work? Because it was metered. It was based on how many times they had access to your documents in a month, or right in a month.
Well, so I will say that. sort of sat down with my co-founders and said, hey, we need to monetize this. Ads isn't going to get it done. At least it wasn't looking that way. And so I want to run let's do a survey. Let's send a survey out to our email distribution that at the time was like 180,000 people. And let's just say, hey, we're going to move to a premium subscription. Who wants in? Because to build out the commerce flow, like no experience, didn't know how long that was going to take. And so getting the team excited about it, the survey was necessary. So we just went and asked everybody, would you upgrade if it was this much or this much? And then, a bunch of people said yes. And then we did get early access to premium for, 40% off, fill out this form. You don't even need to give us your credit card. And, I sent that out on like a Tuesday afternoon and went to check it Wednesday morning. And there was like 500 people who pre-registered. And so we all started looking at each other and they're like, hey, there might be a business here. Cause that was just one email. Asking for upgrade. And so it was just off to the races then. It was like, now let's figure out the gates and the meters and everything else, because to that point, we hadn't even contemplated what that might look like or how much you get for free before you register. And once you register, how much you get before we ask you to pull out your credit card, on and on. Like none of that was tested or understood how to do it. But once we knew that there was 500 people who would pay us, we endeavored to figure it out.
So what happened? How did you actually roll out the paywall? How was it designed?
Yeah, so it's all integrated, and it's gotten better over time, but it's all integrated into the experience. And so the best analogy, the best analog for our business is Shutterstock. So Shutterstock is, you go online, you Google search for guy on phone, you see a bunch of images of a guy on a phone, all of which have watermarks. You click on one of those watermarks, you go to Shutterstock. Shutterstock's like, okay, you got some options. You can download this one image for X dollars, or you can upgrade to a subscription and get all the images you want or some variation of that. And that's effectively what we did. So we have all of this long tail, except it's not guy on phone. It's indemnification clause. You download that or you try to copy that, you get prompted, and we try to give you, both from an SEO perspective and from a sort of first value, first experience perspective, we try to give you as much as we can before we prompt you to do anything, so that the users that only need that one picture of the guy on the phone, to continue with that analogy, they get what they need and they leave and they may never come back. But there's thousands of people who need more than that. And those are the people who we're trying to build a subscription around. They get some value for free. And at some point we say, start a free trial. The trial is, we go between 7 days and 30 days, but it's typically 7. And if you continue on after your trial, then it's $30 a month, or $250 a year, and that's it. And I think 25% go annual, the rest go monthly, and that's the simplicity of it. It's obviously much more complex in terms of the testing we do to see where exactly the gates are, how many exact clicks and downloads do you get before we prompt you to pay. Whether or not the trial is paid or free, all those things we test, but at the core, it's get some value for free and then enter into a trial.
And unlike someone who hits like the New York Times meter paywall, like someone who hits your paywall is almost certainly using it for their job. There are probably some lawyers charging a client $500 an hour and need to create a contract. So the conversion is probably higher than your average subscription product, because they need this to do their job, usually at that exact moment.
Yeah, it is. It's except that, to be totally transparent, there's a few things going on that we're still working through. So one is that despite the value we give pre-gates, pre-trial, there's still a high percentage of people who need us in a very transactional 1 or 2 times a year way, that are starting the trial with no intent of staying beyond that month. And so we see churn there, and that is what it is. We wish it were better than it is. I do think, to your point, though, that the cost is pretty easy to justify, because this is something that they need for their business that they're probably monetizing. So if you're a lawyer, you're monetizing it by selling services. So you're going to go sell an NDA for $5,000 or whatever. And so using us for $30 for a few days is nothing. Entrepreneurs the same way. If you're trying to do this yourselves and it's this, or go pay a lawyer $5,000, easy to justify. But the issue for us, Simon, is that there are power users that are our best customers. There's one rung down from a power user who are our best customers, but it's when you get below that where someone might not use us more than every 90 days or every 4 months that, we're trying to figure out how to price for that user, because we can't make you search for contracts more than your business dictates, right? I can't create a white paper that's like 10 reasons to search for more contracts on Law Insider. It's either your job necessitates it or it doesn't. Similar to Shutterstock, either you need another stock image of a guy on a phone or you don't. And so we have to figure out the right pricing and the right engagement strategy to optimize for that other cohort, which admittedly we've not yet done.
Yeah. I mean, I guess with the Shutterstock analogy, like I can choose to pay $30 for the rights to one photo, or I can become a subscriber and get a discount, like up to 10 photos a month or something. Right. If I'm like a media organization that actually needs these photos or a designer or somebody who would need these photos on a regular basis. So there are those two different price points.
Right. Yep. And we don't have that second price point yet. I think my SaaS valuation brain is like, oh, I don't want non-recurring revenue. We may go get non-recurring revenue because I've read Shutterstock's sort of annual updates and know how much revenue they do there. So that's probably short-sighted, but I think we started in the right place. We started with a single subscription, single package to validate the business. We're only 2 years into this. Business is healthy, but now we need to start sort of adding product layers and creating different experiences for different user types.
And so you launched that like 18 months ago. You're charging $30 a month, which, like you said, is nothing for a lawyer who's going to upsell that a lot. But that's higher than the subscription to like the New York Times or a lot of others. And then over the 18 months, you have amassed several thousand paying subscribers, right?
Yep. Yeah. So it's been, I know we're talking different dates here. It's been almost exactly 2 years since we launched to the date. So I think it was like January 1st, 2 years ago that we launched. In 2019. And yeah, we're close to 5,000 active paying subscribers now. Growth rate is good. We have a churn problem for sure, but we got from 0 to 5,000 in 2 years. So the churn problem isn't preventing us from growing at a healthy rate. It's just preventing us from blowing up. And so we got to solve it. And that's where we are.
So you're closing in on like $2 million a year just in subscription revenue.
Yeah. So we are over $1 million. There's lots of discounts. It's less. So yeah, you did the quick math there. It's below that. So we're over $1 million as a run rate. So we compute via MRR, but if you multiply by 12, then you can do the math on that. So we're meaningfully above $1 million, not close to 2. And that's the result of lots of discounts and promotions and other things that prevent us from being, just at the 30, times 12 amount.
And so you eventually started adding editorial. It sounds like you wanted to create probably increases your marketing funnel, but B, just to start creating iterative value, right? Like just like make that subscription just a little bit more valuable than it was before. That's kind of your thinking for editorial, right?
Well, yeah, and Simon, this is why I'm one of your 1,000 loyal fans, because your story is similar to mine. I'm not as good at what I do as you are at what you do for sure, but I think that you wrote an article recently about B2B thinking like a media company. And even though we're selling directly to lawyers and not necessarily to their law firms, I think in terms of content marketing and B2B strategy, that the more educational resources that I create around. Nick Mehta, CEO of Gainsight, had a great quote that is sort of, in SaaS, we're solving 10% of the problem with technology, and then the other 90% is really our job. And that is all of the webinars and white papers and guides and everything else that is educating around the software, which is, again, just a part of the solution. And I think that relates to Law Insider, because we're giving you, in some cases, like a 25-page sample executive employment agreement. And like, that can't be the end of the story. Like, you came for that, sure, but what's the best way to design incentive systems? What's the best way to negotiate with a key executive? There's so many adjacent stories and educational materials that we can pack into this. And that, for me, sort of as someone who did a lot of content marketing earlier in my career, it's just so exciting, because now we can start telling the stories and building use cases around our ideal customer profile and moving people through sort of an engagement journey with us in a way that is much more proactive than just waiting there idly for them to download another document.
Yeah, I think that recent piece you're referring to is why every B2B tech company should have a podcast or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's not to plug a competing podcast, but Andreessen Horowitz, they have a great podcast, A16Z. They just did their 500th episode, and the 500th episode is about them building an editorial media business.
Ooh, I got to listen to that.
As a venture capital firm.
Yeah.
And it is mind blowing, because they went so deep into it. And the idea that Ben Horowitz, like the editorial team, was like, great, you're a genius. We need to now make you a brand. Because Mark already is and you're not, but you have all of the horsepower, but now we're going to go turn you into that. And so it's amazing how when you have a team that thinks that way, that you can start accessing clients, and obviously VC isn't the same as B2B, but I think there's a ton of similarities. And I think that article you wrote really resonated with me. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to create the educational resources. We're trying to create, like, go on YouTube, do a Google search for Contract Teardown. I think that's sort of our first step in building a show model that, quite frankly, is just so fun and so exciting to know that we can do all of that. And it all pushes back to a very efficient conversion model that's all e-commerce. So I'm not, I don't have any SDRs or account managers or whatever. It's just, let's create a brand, let's create value, let's push it out there for free, and let's bring people back to this subscription and see what we can do to make this business grow.
And so let's talk about those different components. So you mentioned the contract breakdown. What about, before we get that's like a webinar video type thing. What's the editorial, like, text-based content that you're creating? Is it just like how-to type articles, or are you hiring like contract freelance writers? What's your approach there?
Yeah, so we do one of the things that we do that we learned from you and others is having a community. We have a Law Insider user community on Facebook, and it's exclusive to premium users, and we do a lot of polls there. What kind of content do you want? And despite all of the video content that we love creating, whether it's a webinar or the Contract Teardown show, lawyers want to be able to go back and cite written materials because it's just faster. And it's more efficient for them, and it's sort of more aligned to their working style. And what that is it's guides and it's templates and it's checklists. So I'll just describe a use case. A partner of a law firm walks in, you're an associate, and they're like, great, we have a new client. It's a construction company. They're acquiring another construction company. It's in New York, and you need to do this deal. And you're scratching your head. You're like, you're a first-year associate, and you're like, what? And what you would go to is you would have a checklist, and it said, okay, construction purchase agreement. Here are the clauses that are usually included. Here are the main areas that are most contentiously negotiated. Here are things to consider, jurisdiction, or whatever it may be, insurance provisions. Here's the sort of the limits that we like to agree to in terms of insurance requirements. All of those things create this formula or this playbook. And so those are the written resources that we're starting to invest in. And that stuff's hard, right? I can't go on Upwork and just find a copywriter in the afternoon to go bang out 1,200 words on that. Like, you need to find someone who has lived through that, who's literally an expert in transactional deals of that nature. So it's not easy. It's a lot of work to find the authors to do that. And we're just getting started in that process. So hopefully that answered the question.
So are you putting out a call to your community looking for writers to do a freelance piece or something like that?
We are, but man, it's hard. I thought that would be like, we have these UGC, user generated content visions of this like flywheel of massive, like, rivaling Quora or whatever. Certainly we aspire to that. But the reality is most of our power users are, billing $500 an hour. They're selling contracts for $5,000 a pop. Me being like, hey, you want to write a brief for $500? They're like, no, that's not my job. Like, thanks. Yeah. So it's harder than I'd like it to be, and I'd like to admit that it is, to find these people. But by the way, if you're listening to this and you are one of those people, please call me.
Yeah, certainly you could get like a freelance journalist who might have experience writing about legal stuff to interview an expert on that, and then kind of write an article around it or something like that.
Right.
So it may not be able to be someone writing it from the first person from their experience, but someone who knows enough about the law to interview someone else for a half an hour and then distill that, for in an article that serves basically the same purpose. Do these articles, do they count towards the paywall at all, or is this more kind of just marketing?
Yeah, so I don't know yet. Right now they don't, and I need to figure that out. And so you and I have had some chats around Substack and their model, and of watching. I try to subscribe to people on Patreon and Substack to see the different ways to gate different types of content. But I don't think we have enough yet for me to really think critically about, like Farnham Street is one that I look at. Like, I don't know. Short answer is I don't know, but I think when we get a corpus or body of work that's big enough, then I'll be able to productize it better than we are today. And
talk to me about contract breakdown. What is that?
Contract teardown. Yeah. So totally stole this idea from a company called Profitwell that does pricing analytics and pricing consulting for SaaS companies, how you should price. And something that they do is they do the pricing teardown, pricing page teardown. Well, they'll look at how HubSpot or how Salesforce or whomever, how they price, and whether or not they're adopting a good, what's often referred to as good, better, best pricing strategy, or if they're leaving money on the table. And it's really well produced and it's really engaging. And I happen to love pricing, so I nerd out on it. And I think I'll try to explain this, or I'll try to articulate this concisely, Simon. But as a content marketer, I think maybe you can translate what I'm about to say. But it's not enough to create compelling content for your business. The idea is to create compelling content that has connective tissue and relates directly back to the product that you serve or that you deliver, and that's something that you can envision doing for 5 years, doing hundreds of or thousands of. And so finding what that was for Law Insider wasn't immediately obvious. And then it was sort of connecting the dots of, wait a minute, we have millions of contracts. Each one is unique. Each one has good and bad. If you can get a lawyer that really hates or really loves certain aspects of, Oracle's license agreement, Salesforce license agreement, Fiverr's terms and conditions, like, wow, this is unlimited. And so many lawyers have strong opinions about very specific documents or provisions. And we bring them on, we give them a platform, and we have a host, and we're talking through and literally tearing down an agreement and walking through a lawyer or a law student or an entrepreneur what aspects of it are good or bad or could have been drafted better or really clever or clearly really contentious. And that's why they came up with this compromise. And we could do this forever, right? Like, we could do contract teardown for 10 years and we would have not even scratched the surface of of the enormity of documents available for us to tear down. So it took us a while to get there. I think we just published our maybe 15th or 16th episode. So we're still in the early days, but man, it's fun.
And you're doing that on YouTube?
Doing that on YouTube. And we need to seek your guidance on whether or not we need to move that over to podcasts as well. And then we're about to launch in 2 weeks. We're going to do our first contract teardown in Espanol. So we're going to start doing foreign language teardowns as well.
And you mean it's a host, so they're getting on some kind of video chat with somebody else, right?
Right. Yeah. Split screen, host next to the guest, and then you'll see visuals of the section of the contract highlighted. We invested in some production, so there's sort of an intro and an outro, and still trying to figure out YouTube. I think we have 22 or 2,300 subscribers, and each video gets about anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 views. So we're just at the beginning stages of this, but we feel good about it. We get really good response from our subscribers, and that's sort of the magic for us in the early days is the people who already love us or who sort of are on the fence about whether or not they love us. Are they seeing this as valuable? And I think based on the comments we get and the usage or the sort of the viewership we're seeing, it signals well in that area.
Yeah, that seems like it'd be ripe to just create a podcast version of that, since it seems like you have it's basically a recorded video form. And we've been seeing evidence that like recorded video podcasts actually perform surprisingly well on YouTube.
But what does that mean though? Does that mean that you're taking a video version and just taking out the video and layering in the audio and creating a different intro outro that's podcast specific, or are you actually doing a separate show that's podcast only?
I think it's taking the show. I remember watching like a part of an episode. It seems like it's sort of already podcast ready in the sense of like, yeah, maybe you have to put in a slightly different intro to kind of, set up like what they're going to be talking about. But assuming that like most of the visuals is just the people talking, and like people on the podcast can understand what they're talking about without actually seeing the video, it probably, you wouldn't have to do that much extra work to just create like an audio version for people to listen to.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah, we need to do that.
And so you have this massive database of email addresses. Are you creating like a newsletter? Is that how you're driving a lot of traffic? I mean, obviously Google is a big driver of traffic, but like in terms of driving repeat traffic to your editorial content, how are you doing that?
Yes. The short answer is yes. So we do webinar events that we promote. We promote twice a month a contract teardown. We've done sort of different tests on newsletter. Like, what's a newsletter, right? It's an email you send with some regularity that has some sort of consistency or expectation of what it includes, right? And I don't think we've landed on our ultimate newsletter product. I also don't think, like, I'm embarrassed to say how little work we've done in list segmentation. So we have a long way to go there, but the short answer to your question is yes, we promote our content and push people back to the site to consume that content. One of our OKRs for 2021 is to drive up user engagement, and we get these great stats from, I bring up ProfitWell again because we use them we're a vendor they're a vendor of ours, and they show one of the stats that we focus on is number of active paying subscribers, percentage of active paying subscribers that have logged in the last 30 days. And that number, we're trying to get that number to like 62 or 63%. And today I think it's like 52%. And admittedly, I'm revealing that not knowing if that's an awful score. So if someone else has this data for their own company and they want to tell me that that's an awful score, I'd love to know that. But we're trying to improve bringing people back on with greater regularity. And we think that content and email, to your question, is a good way to do that.
Yeah, I think the open rate for my paid newsletters are like 60%, which I'm always like, why isn't it higher? They're paying for this newsletter. Why aren't they opening it? But 60% is about where I am. And you've added advertising into the mix too, right?
Yeah, so we have, and we're still trying to figure that out. So have spent a bunch of time listening to every podcast I can with the founder of Duolingo, trying to understand the relationship of that business with subscription and ads, and what the CEO, the sort of the model that they had is that the ads is not why you're here. Similar to Spotify, the ads are used to distinguish between free and premium. Mm-hmm. And so you use ads to fund the free users and to create a slightly degraded experience. So, the point at which you don't want to see them anymore, you'll be compelled to upgrade. And so that's kind of like in a probably unsophisticated way how we're doing it now. But I think we were reluctant to build an ad network. Ads just seems like a hard business. Although, I need to talk to Claudius and better understand what the guys, Austin and others, are doing at Morning Brew, because I think they're crushing it with email ads, which is something we may do in the future. But just impression ads on the website right now is just it's a good revenue driver. We're a bootstrap company. It's great having that predictable revenue every month. But the next stage is actually thinking of the ads more intentionally. Who are we advertising? It shouldn't just be Ford and Geico and whatever other retargeting traffic we're getting. It should be, something that is in the legal tech space or relates to lawyers. And that's sort of the next step for us, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah. So right now it's just kind of, you have an ad network that's serving up programmatic ads, and it's just extra nice to have revenue for all this traffic that's just coming in through Google and bouncing off.
Yep. That's it.
So what are your ambitions to expand in terms of editorial? Like, do you see yourself hiring an editor-in-chief, hiring legal journalists, different stuff like that, building an entire kind of media company around this database, kind of like a Reuters or a Bloomberg or some of these other kind of things that started out as purely information subscriptions and have kind of expanded beyond that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that one of your recent podcasts, it escapes me right now, but literally
the Freight Waves one, the freight industry.
You were like, "What's your org chart?" And he walks through the org chart, and I took notes and tried to diagram what he described.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we're headed. That's not something I've built out large sales orgs and marketing orgs, but I've never built out an editorial team before. Understanding how to do that is a blind spot for us. So we will continue to invest sort of in shows and in campaigns and in initiatives in sort of an unstructured way until we get a little bit bigger and can afford to start hiring more people full time for that. But yeah, I think that's where we're going. And I think that, my other background has been in online education and compliance in particular. And so I'm very interested in creating, potentially a certification program, non-US attorneys, take a, 3-week course on US contract law. There's so many educational opportunities, I think, masterclass type series where there's tests and quizzes, and at the end you get a certificate. Very interested in that. Very interested in written material and templates and guides and checklists as I described earlier. And yeah, I just think that we need to do our homework to figure out how to build that, and we need to be a little bit bigger than we are now to fund it.
Okay, Preston, well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so lawinsider.com is the website. Go check out Contract Teardown on YouTube. And I'm all over Twitter at Preston J. Clark.
Awesome. Well, it's a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Simon.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast. So if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.